How to identify assumptions in the art of practical reasoning. We want to be able to cultivate the intellectual abilities to do several things. First of all, we want to be able to identify and evaluate assumptions. Secondly, we want to be able to follow an argument to its conclusion. Third, we want to be able to spot contradictions and faulty logic. Fourth, draw appropriate distinctions between various aspects of the argument. 5, avoid extremes, because we have many different types of examples of individuals who become hyperbolic or exaggerate and end up on either end of a spectrum, and that is not effective argumentation. And finally, we want to be able to exercise foresight in, as Weaver says, appealing to the whole man out of his whole being and with reference to history. So we want to use what others have learn vicariously through them or from them, so that we are not bound to make the same mistakes. The 3 basic tools then for developing practical reasoning in the classical model use syllogistic logic to identify assumptions and follow an argument to its conclusion. We use dialectic to spot contradictions, and we use an awareness of common material fallacies to spot faulty logic. And of course, if you watch the Super Bowl commercials, you know that faulty logic abounded in those commercials, in the advertisers' desire to persuade us of or to do something or buy something. Categorical syllogisms then are made up of that very famous mathematical formula. So for example, all A are B. If C is an A, then C is a B. And of course, the classical example that's used is the one with all men are mortal. There's your major premise. Socrates is a man. That's your minor premise. Socrates is mortal. There's the conclusion of the syllogism. Aristotle's definition of syllogism, however, is a little bit different. Notice that Socrates uses a more logical, mathematical arrangement of argumentation. Aristotle uses words or a verbal means to describe his syllogism. And he says that discourse in which certain things being stated, something other than what is stated follows of necessity from their being so. Now that's kind of an awkward way to say something, but let me break it apart so that it makes sense. So what does this mean? Well, consider this example. If I say all real computers are PCs, and then I say John's machine is an Apple, therefore, what is the unstated conclusion that which follows of necessity according to logic? In other words, what is the third part of the syllogism? So if I say all real computers are PCs, John's machine is an Apple, then what would follow would be John's machine is not a real computer. How did you know that this was the conclusion? Well, the answer is obvious, but why? Because our minds operate according to laws of thought. And it would be nonsense, in the most robust sense of the word, to conclude from the stated premises anything other than John's machine is not a real computer. What would you say to someone who, given the premises that we stated earlier, concluded that John is disabled? Well, you would say, what's that got to do with those premises? That conclusion does not follow from the premises that were stated earlier. And so therefore, a conclusion such as John is disabled creates a syllogism which is invalid. So let's talk about the validity of an argument then. Aristotle asserts that a syllogism is valid if the things that are unstated follow according to the laws of thought necessarily from what was stated, if what was stated is so. All right, so we're going to break this apart. We know that an argument is valid when the conclusion follows from the premises logically. Whether or not it's true is another question. So we have this difference between validity and truth as far as argumentation is concerned. So drawing inferences about implicit premises is important, and here's why. If one recognizes when the conclusion follows logically from premises, one can, with some precision, draw inferences about premises that are left unstated. And remember that we want to get to those unstated premises in any kind of debate or argument. The reader must identify the unstated premises in the arguments analyzed, and then this knowledge helps one follow an argument to its conclusion, thus identifying any implicit assumptions that are being made within that argument. So here's an example of a syllogism that is valid yet untrue. All college students are skiers, so here's my major premise. Herbert is a college student, all right, my minor premise. Therefore, Herbert skis. Now that was, according to the laws of thought, according to logic, that was the expected conclusion to that syllogism. So this argument is valid in that it follows the expected form, but it is not necessarily true. It could be true Herbert may ski, but only by coincidence, not by logical necessity. Okay, so what is wrong with this syllogism is that the major premise is flawed. There are obviously college students who do not know how to ski, so the major premise is untrue. So analyzing assumptions and enthymemes then, in order to fully analyze a controversy, one has to be able to identify the questions at the heart of the controversy, and many times those questions are the things that are left unstated. If your argument has valid form, and if the premises are true, then we say that the argument is sound. So both have to be in place, valid form and truth claim. Here's another very critical point to understand. An enthymeme is a syllogism with one of the propositions missing. That's Weaver's definition, and as well as Aristotle's. Okay, so let's go with this idea that an enthymeme is an argument in which one proposition is suppressed or it's missing for one reason or another. Here are some examples. In some cases, the missing proposition is not stated because it's obvious. So if I say, "You'll be fine, just follow your heart." Well, what's missing? The missing premise is that all persons who follow their heart are persons who do fine. Note that the explicit statement of the missing premise makes the argument somewhat dubious. In other words, we question whether that argument is actually a true truth claim or not. In other words, if the missing proposition were present, the argument might lose rhetorical force. So for example, if I say something such as, "Mary does well because she pays attention," the missing premise would be that all people paying attention are people who do well. But let's ask ourselves, is this actually true? Is it true that if all people who are paying attention are the ones that do well? Well, it seems like that's reasonable, but there may be some instance where some persons who are not paying attention or who pay attention might not do well. Occasionally, the proposition is suppressed in an effort to conceal the unsoundness or the invalidity of the argument. So this would be a form of sophistry and trickery if this were deliberately done. So for example, no cars with internal combustion engines are energy efficient, so no American-made cars are energy efficient. The missing premise would be the false premise, all American-made cars are cars with internal combustion engines, which is not true because we do have some cars that use other means of creating energy. Note that many accounts define an enthymeme as an argument in which a premise is missing. Nevertheless, some enthymemes can omit the conclusion for rhetorical effect. In other words, most of the time, the missing part of the enthymeme is either the major premise or the minor premise. However, there are instances where the conclusion is what is actually left out. Here's an example. Self-absorbed people don't help charities, and I know you not to be self-absorbed. The missing conclusion would be, so I'm sure you will help. And it has been left unstated in order to be effective on defensively motivated persons, right? So if I don't say, so I'm sure you will help, if I leave that unstated, but it's implied, other person understands the rhetorical force of my enthematic statement there. Okay, so that concludes a little overview of how enthymeme works, and remember that um, in your work on the analysis of a controversy policy speech, that you will be looking for those hidden assumptions, those enthymemes, those unstated premises, major and minor premises, as well as occasionally the unstated conclusions to the arguments that underlie the surface issue. I'll talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye. What? It didn't record? Crap.
This is a screencast to show how you can set the microphone recording volume.